Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the producer surplus. So the idea of the producer surplus is roughly comparable to what we were talking about in the consumer surplus. So as indicated in the earlier videos, the supply curve, again, is simply the aggregation of all the marginal cost curves of the individual firms. So remember, the marginal cost curve is each individual firm's supply curve. So we kind of put those all together and we get the market supply. So each point along the industry supply curve, so here we have the industry supply curve, represents the sum of the profit maximizing level output of all firms at a particular price. So again, that's just kind of what underlies the supply curve. Okay, so if we look at the supply curve, at a given price, if we look at any price, the supply curve simply tells us how many units of the good is going to be supplied by the industry at that particular price. Okay, so we have some price here is along green dotted line. So the industry generates this amount of the good. Okay, so simply speaking, if we look at the product of the price times the quantity, so the area of this box simply represents the total revenue generated by the industry from selling this amount of the good at this price. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, we've got that. So the key here is how do we so that's the total income, but there's costs involved in that. So if we remember that this supply curve is really the idea of the marginal cost for the industry, what we can say is that, if you remember from the previous video, that if we sum all the marginal costs, that will give us the total cost of production. So again, if we're looking at this supply curve, if the industry is producing Q1, the area under the supply curve and bounded by that quantity and the axes represents, roughly speaking, the total cost of production. Okay, so we've got this area of total cost, we've got this area of total revenue. So what does that leave us? Well, we have this area of the total revenue which is unaccounted for. When we were looking at the individual firms before, we could have characterized this area as the profit. But in this exercise, we're going to be talking about this idea of the area, the area under the price, above the supply curve, and bounded by the vertical axis. That's going to be the producer surplus. Okay, so we have total revenue, total cost, and we're going to call this remaining area the producer surplus. So what do we see as price changes? As the price goes up, quantity supplied to the industry goes up, marginal cost goes up. But we see a producer surplus increasing. As the price comes down, less is produced, there's a lower cost, and there's a smaller producer surplus. So again, we can kind of track how producer surplus is changing as the price changes. So again, I'm just going to reinforce this idea of supply is equivalent to marginal cost. So again, like we did in the previous video talking about consumer surplus and marginal benefit, I just want to go through an interpretation. If we're at some point, let's say the price is $6, well, the supply when the price is $6 is going to be this Q1, and it's the same thing as saying the marginal cost is $6. So what's the interpretation? Well, again, because the marginal cost is telling us the change in total cost as we increase our production by 1 unit, the interpretation would be if the marginal cost is $6, if we increase our production by 1 more unit, we're going to have to expend $6 in additional resources to produce that last unit of the good. Okay? So again, we're kind of setting it up What is the supply? It's equal to the marginal cost. How do we calculate the producer surplus? We talk about how producer surplus changes as the price goes up and down. And this will lead up to the next video, which will start bringing together this idea of producer surplus and consumer surplus to talk about kind of the well-being of overall society.